He was an old lawyer in a cheap suit, but what he brought with him would change my life forever. What I discovered in my grandmother's abandoned house wasn't just a secret. It was a second chance I never knew I had. If this is your first time here, and you believe that our past doesn't have to define our future, maybe think about subscribing. We tell stories for people who've had to fight for their happy endings. The day I turned 18 was the day I legally ceased to exist, at least as far as the state was concerned. For 10 years, I had been a file in a cabinet, a line item in a budget, a ward of the system. Now, I was just Leo. No last name that mattered, no family to call, no home to return to. The group home, a sterile brick building that always smelled faintly of bleach and regret, had prepared me for this day with a series of pamphlets on budgeting and a single cardboard box for my belongings. All my worldly possessions fit with room to spare. 3 changes of clothes, a worn copy of a book I'd read a dozen times, and a faded photograph of a woman I barely remembered, my grandmother. The home's director, Mrs. Gable, a woman whose smile never quite reached her eyes, called me into her office. It was a formality, the final checkout. She handed me an envelope containing my emancipation stipend, a few $100s meant to launch me into the world. It felt less like a launch and more like a shove off a cliff. "We wish you the best, Leo," she said, her voice practiced and detached. "The world is what you make of it." I nodded, the words hollow and useless. My world, for as long as I could remember, had been made for me by others. Schedules, rules, locked doors. The concept of making my own was as foreign as a language I'd never heard. That's when he arrived. A man I'd never seen before stood in the doorway of Mrs. Gable's office. He was older, maybe in his late 60s, with graying hair combed neatly to one side, and a suit that had seen better decades. He carried a worn leather briefcase and looked profoundly out of place in the institutional beige of the hallway. "Leo Vance?" he asked. His voice was calm, steady. It was the first time I'd heard my full name spoken by a stranger in years. Mrs. Gable looked from him to me, her expression a mixture of annoyance and curiosity. "And you are?" "Aris Thorne," the man said, offering a slight nod. "I'm an attorney. I represent the estate of Eleanor Vance." My grandmother's name. It hit me like a physical blow, a ghost walking into the room. Eleanor Vance was a myth, a half-remembered scent of cinnamon and soil, the woman in the photograph who had, according to my file, abandoned me at a bus station when I was 8 years old. Her will had been read shortly after her death 2 years ago, a non-event for me since I was a minor in state custody. The system had absorbed the news with bureaucratic silence. I was told there was nothing left, nothing for me. "Mr. Vance is no longer a ward of this facility," Mrs. Gable said stiffly. "His business is his own." It was a dismissal, her washing her hands of me one last time. Mr. Thorne gave her a polite, unbothered smile, and then turned his full attention to me. "May I have a moment of your time, son? There are some matters regarding your grandmother's estate that were complicated. Now that you've reached the age of majority, we can finally address them." I followed him out to the curb, my single box under my arm. The world outside the group home's gate felt impossibly large and loud. We sat on a cold concrete bench, the city's traffic humming a nervous rhythm around us. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope. The paper was old, softened at the edges. "Your grandmother's passing was sudden," he began, choosing his words with care. "The state was notified, of course. They concluded her estate was insolvent, a small, heavily mortgaged property, significant tax arrears. It was deemed worthless, and so, officially, you inherited nothing. I shrugged. It was the story I'd always known. Okay, but that wasn't the entire truth, he continued, his eyes meeting mine. They were kind eyes, I realized. Tired, but kind. Eleanor was my client for many years. She was a very particular woman, deliberate. She set things up in a specific way. He slid a single, heavy, old-fashioned iron key out of the envelope. It was ornate, rusted in the grooves, and felt cold and heavy in my palm. She left you this. It was to be delivered to you on your 18th birthday, and not a day before. I stared at the key. It was a real object from a life I thought was a dream. What's it for? It's for the house, he said. Her house, out in Cinder Creek County. It's yours now, Leo, officially. He went on to explain the details, the language, a fog of legal terms. The property was in a remote, unincorporated part of the state. The back taxes owed to the county were substantial, nearly $10,000. An offer had already been made on the land by a development corporation, a lowball figure that would barely cover the debt and leave me with a few $1,000s. The offer was on the table for 30 days. After that, the county would seize the property and auction it off. So I inherited a debt, I said, the familiar bitterness creeping back into my voice. It felt like a cruel joke. The woman who left me with nothing had managed to leave me with less than nothing. Or you've inherited a choice, Mr. Thorne corrected gently. The company, West Pine Development, they want the land for the timber and water rights. They're offering you $15,000. After the tax lien, you'd walk away with about $5,000. It's a clean break, a fresh start. $5,000. It was more money than I had ever held in my life. It was a bus ticket to anywhere, a security deposit on an apartment, a buffer against the world that was waiting to chew me up. It was the smart choice, the only choice. Or, I asked, hating the flicker of hope in my own chest. Or you find a way to pay the taxes and keep the property, he said, his expression unreadable. Eleanor, she loved that land. She wanted you to have it. That's all I know for sure. He handed me the envelope. Inside was the deed, a map with a hand-drawn circle around a plot of land, and the developer's formal offer. There was also a small, sealed note. My name was written on the front, in a shaky, elegant script I recognized from the one birthday card I'd ever received from her, years ago. I have to advise you as a lawyer to take the money, Leo, Mr. Thorne said, standing up. It's the practical, sensible thing to do. But as the man who knew your grandmother, I have to advise you to at least go see it first. Cinder Creek is a long way from here, but a bus ticket is cheap. He gave me his card. Call me when you've made a decision. You have 30 days. And then he was gone, leaving me on the bench with a key, a map, and a ghost. The $5,000 felt like a life raft, but the key felt like an anchor, pulling me toward a past I had spent a decade trying to forget. I sat there for a long time, the city noise fading into a dull roar. For the first time in my life, I had no one telling me where to go or what to do. I had a choice, and it terrified me. That night I slept on a cot in a shelter, the iron key clutched in my hand, its cold weight a strange and unwelcome comfort. The next morning, I bought a one-way bus ticket to a place I'd never been, a place that was, for better or worse, mine. The bus ride was a slow, rattling transition from one world to another. It pulled away from the city's gray sprawl, leaving behind the concrete and the noise, and edged into the green, forgotten corners of the state. For hours, I watched the landscape change through the smudged window. The tight grid of streets gave way to winding country roads. The tall buildings were replaced by rolling hills and dense forests of pine and oak. It was a world that breathed at a different pace, slow and deep. I felt like a foreign object being carried into it, something manufactured and out of place. My fellow passengers were few: an old woman knitting a shapeless scarf, a young soldier sleeping with his head against the glass, a mother trying to quiet a restless child. They all seemed to belong to the world outside the window. I belonged nowhere. I took out the note Mr. Thorne had given me. My name, Leo, written in my grandmother's hand. I had traced those letters 100 times. I opened it. The paper was brittle, and the message inside was short. My dear boy, if you are reading this, I am gone, and you are a man. I know you have questions. The answers are at home. Be brave. The key opens more than the door. Always, Eleanor. The answers are at home. The words echoed in my head. What home? The only home I'd known was a series of temporary placements, rooms that never felt like mine. This place, this Cinder Creek, was just a name on a map, a liability, a debt. But the note, it was the first direct communication I'd had from her in a decade. It felt less like a message and more like a summons. The bus wheezed to a stop in what could barely be called a town. It was a crossroads, with a gas station, a general store with a sagging porch, and a post office. The sign read, "Welcome to Harmony," but the name felt ironic. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine needles, a silence so profound it felt louder than the city traffic. I was the only one who got off. The bus driver, a heavy-set man with a kind, weathered face, looked at me with open curiosity. "This is your stop, son?" "I think so," I said, showing him the map Mr. Thorne had given me. "I'm looking for a property off Old Mill Road." He squinted at the map, then at me. "Vance property. Haven't heard that name in a while. Old Eleanor's place. You family?" "Her grandson," I said, the words feeling strange on my tongue. He nodded slowly, his expression shifting to something like sympathy. "Tough woman, your grandmother. Kept to herself. That place has been sitting empty for a couple of years now. It's a good 5-mile walk from here. You got a ride?" I shook my head. My entire life savings, minus the bus fare, was a couple $100 in my pocket. A taxi was a luxury I couldn't imagine. "Well," he said, sighing, "the road gets muddy this time of year. Watch your step." He closed the bus doors, and with a hiss of air brakes, my last link to the world I knew pulled away, leaving me alone in the oppressive quiet. The walk was long. The road was more of a suggestion, a dirt track that wound its way deeper into the woods. The trees grew thick on either side, their branches interlocking overhead, creating a green tunnel. The light that filtered through was dim, dappled. It was beautiful, but it was an intimidating, wild beauty. I felt small, an intruder. Every rustle in the undergrowth made my city-honed nerves jump. I was a boy raised on concrete and sirens, and this deep, organic silence was unsettling. After what felt like an eternity, I saw it. A rusted mailbox, half swallowed by overgrown bushes, with the name Vance barely visible beneath the rust. A gravel driveway, now more weeds than gravel, led into the trees. I followed it, my heart pounding a nervous rhythm against my ribs. And then the woods opened up, and I saw the house. It was small, a simple wooden cabin with a tin roof that was streaked with rust. The paint, once probably a cheerful blue, had peeled and faded to a ghostly gray. The porch sagged on one side, and the windows were dark and vacant, like eyes that had been closed for a long time. The entire property was being reclaimed by nature. Wild roses and tangled vines crawled up the walls, and the yard was a meadow of tall grass and wildflowers. It wasn't just neglected, it was wild, abandoned. For a moment, all I could feel was a crushing sense of disappointment. This was it. This was the grand inheritance. A ruin. The developer's offer of $5,000 suddenly seemed incredibly generous. I could turn around right now, walk back to that desolate town, and catch the next bus out. I could take the money and never look back. It was the smart thing to do. But I had walked all this way, and I had the key. I pushed my way through the tall grass, the seeds and burrs clinging to my jeans. The air on the porch was still and heavy. A rocking chair sat in the corner, covered in a fine layer of dust and leaves, as if its occupant had just gotten up and walked away. I stood before the front door, the wood swollen and weathered. The keyhole was dark and filled with a spider web. I took a deep breath, my hand shaking slightly as I pulled the old iron key from my pocket. It felt ancient, a relic from a forgotten time. The key slid into the lock with a gritty metallic scrape. It was stiff. I had to put my shoulder into it, turning with all my weight. For a second, I thought it was rusted shut, that this was the final, pathetic failure. And then, with a loud, groaning crack, the lock turned. The sound echoed in the silent clearing. It was the sound of something sealed being opened. I pushed the door. It swung inward on protesting hinges, revealing the darkness within. A wave of cool, musty air washed over me, the smell of dust, old wood, and time itself. It was the smell of a place that had been waiting. I stood on the threshold, caught between two worlds, the overgrown, wild outside and the dark, secret-filled inside. My grandmother's note came back to me. The key opens more than the door. I didn't know what that meant, but I knew I couldn't turn back now. I stepped inside, and the door swung shut behind me with a soft, final click, plunging me into the shadows of the past. The darkness inside the house was thick, broken only by thin slivers of light forcing their way through the grimy window panes. Dust motes danced in these pale beams like tiny, forgotten ghosts. My eyes slowly adjusted, and the room began to take shape around me. It was a single, open space, a living room, kitchen, and dining area combined. A stone fireplace stood against one wall, its hearth cold and black. The furniture, a worn armchair, a simple wooden table with two chairs, a sagging bookshelf, was all covered in white dust cloths, making the room look like a collection of shrouded figures. It was a place frozen in time. A cup and saucer sat on the small counter by the sink, as if waiting for tea to be poured. A stack of books on the nightstand had a pair of reading glasses resting on top. It was as if my grandmother had simply vanished mid-motion. The air was heavy with her absence. I walked through the room, my footsteps unnaturally loud on the creaking floorboards. I ran my hand over the back of the armchair, the worn fabric soft beneath the dust. Did I remember this place? Vague, fleeting images surfaced in my mind, like fragments of a dream. A fire crackling in that hearth, the smell of baking bread, the feeling of being small, held in someone's arms in that very chair, looking out the window at falling snow. Were they real memories, or just things my lonely mind had invented over the years? I couldn't be sure. The official story was that she had given me up, left me at a bus station with a bag and a note pinned to my jacket. But this house didn't feel like the home of a woman who would do that. It felt loved. It felt lived in. It felt like a sanctuary. I explored the rest of the small cabin. There was one bedroom with a simple iron frame bed neatly made, and a small bathroom. Everything was clean, orderly, just still. In the bedroom, on the wall above the dresser, was a single framed photograph. It was of me, a much younger version, maybe 5 or 6 years old. I was missing a front tooth and grinning, holding up a small, lumpy clay pot I had obviously just made. Standing behind me, with her hands on my shoulders, was my grandmother. Her smile was proud, her eyes full of a fierce, protective love. I stared at that picture for a long time. It was the same woman from the faded photo in my box, but here she was alive, vibrant. This was the woman from my fragmented memories. The developer's offer echoed in my mind. $15,000. Sell the land, sell this house, sell this memory. Erase it all and start fresh. It was so tempting. This place was a painful question mark, a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to solve. The answer might be worse than the mystery. Maybe she really did abandon me, and this was all just a monument to her guilt. I went back to the main room, my mind a storm of confusion and grief. I sat down at the wooden table, the dust cloth crunching under my weight. What now? What was I even looking for? The answers are at home, her note had said. I looked around the room, really looked this time, searching for anything out of place. My eyes scanned the bookshelf, filled with old hardcovers, gardening manuals, poetry, classic novels. I ran my fingers along the stone of the fireplace. I looked under the furniture. Nothing. Then I noticed it. The floor. Most of it was made of wide, dark wooden planks, but near the hearth, one section seemed different. The boards were slightly newer, the color a shade lighter. One of them had a small, almost invisible notch near the edge. My heart quickened. I knelt down, my fingers tracing the seams. I dug my fingernails into the notch and pulled. The board resisted, then lifted with a low groan. Beneath it was a dark, hollow space. And nestled inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a metal box. It was an old ammunition box, heavy and solid, painted army green. It had a sturdy latch, but it was locked with a small brass padlock. I lifted it out. It was heavy, and something shifted inside with a dull thud. This had to be it. This had to be what she meant. I looked around the room for something to break the lock with. In the fireplace, a set of iron tools, a poker, tongs, a small shovel, leaned against the stone. I took the poker. It was heavy in my hand. I wedged the tip into the shackle of the padlock and twisted, putting all my weight and frustration into it. The metal strained, groaned, and then with a sharp snap, the lock broke. My hands were shaking as I unfastened the latch and lifted the lid. I half expected to find money, or jewelry, or something of tangible value. But it wasn't any of those things. The box was filled to the brim with letters, stacks and stacks of them, tied in bundles with twine. And on top of the first bundle was a single folded piece of paper. I picked it up. It was a birth certificate. Mine, Leo Vance. And listed under the father's name was a name I had only ever seen in my state file. Marcus Thorne. Not Thorne, I corrected myself. Marcus Kane. My father. A man I knew nothing about except that he had disappeared before I was born. My breath caught in my throat. I picked up the first bundle of letters. They were all addressed to me, in that same elegant, slightly shaky handwriting. The postmarks were dated, starting from almost 10 years ago, right after I was placed in the system. They had never been sent. She had written them, dated them, and saved them, all for me. I untied the twine on the first bundle and took out the top letter. The paper was thin, almost translucent with age. I unfolded it, and I began to read. My dearest Leo, it has been 1 week since I left you. It is the longest week of my life. I hope when you read this, you are old enough to understand. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me. I need you to know, first and foremost, that I did not abandon you. I saved you. The story you have been told is a lie, a necessary one, a shield. The truth is far more dangerous. Your father, Marcus, was not a good man. I loved him once, a long time ago, but that love was blind to the darkness in him. He was involved with very bad people, a criminal network that stretched further than I ever knew. He owed them a great deal of money, and when he couldn't pay, he ran. He disappeared, leaving me, and leaving you, to face his debts. They came for us, Leo. They came to this house. They wanted to take you as leverage, as payment. I fought them. I hid you. But I knew they would never stop looking. The system, the state, it is a cold and imperfect place, I know. But it is also anonymous. It is a fortress of paperwork and bureaucracy. It was the one place I could hide you where they would never think to look. A child abandoned by a poor old woman is forgotten. A child taken by criminals is a pawn forever. So I made the hardest choice of my life. I drove you to that bus station. I pinned that note to your coat. And I walked away, my heart breaking with every step. I watched from across the street until a police officer found you. It was the most terrible and the most necessary day of my life. I had to stop reading. The room was spinning. My entire life, the bedrock of my identity, was built on the story of my abandonment. It was the central wound that had shaped me. The anger I held for my grandmother was a shield I had used to protect myself from the pain. And now, with a few sentences, she had shattered it. It wasn't abandonment. It was protection. It wasn't a betrayal. It was a sacrifice. Tears streamed down my face, hot and sudden. I wasn't crying for the boy who was left behind. I was crying for the woman who had to walk away. I cried for the years we had lost, for the misunderstanding that had defined my existence. I picked up the next letter, and the next, and the next. I sat there on the floor of that dusty, silent house and read for hours as the light outside faded from afternoon gold to the deep blue of twilight. The letters told a story of the last 10 years of her life. She wrote to me every week. She told me about her garden, about the harsh winters and the beautiful springs. She told me stories about my mother, who had died when I was a baby. She told me about her own life, her hopes, her fears. And woven throughout was the story of her secret vigilance. She had followed my life from a distance, using Mr. Thorne as an intermediary to get what little information he could legally obtain. She knew which group homes I was in. She knew when I was struggling. She wrote about her frustration, her helplessness at not being able to reach out, to comfort me. "They are still out there, Leo," one letter read. "I hear whispers now and then, your father's name. They haven't forgotten the debt. As long as they believe you are a lost, forgotten ward of the state, you are safe. The moment I claim you, you become a target again. And so I wait. I keep this house for you. I make it a place you can one day call home, a place where you will be safe." In a later letter, she wrote about the developers. "A company wants to buy the land. They offer a lot of money. But this land is more than just timber and dirt, Leo. It is our fortress. It is remote. It is private. It is defensible. The money is tempting, a way to make my last years more comfortable. But it is your birthright. It is your safety. I will not sell. I will hold it for you, no matter the cost." The cost had been the back taxes. She had been living on a meager pension, pouring every spare cent into a secret savings, hoping to have enough to clear the debt before she passed the land to me. The final letters were written in a weaker, shakier hand. She knew she was getting sick. She knew her time was running out. "My boy, I am afraid I won't be there to give you these letters myself. I am so tired. Mr. Thorne will know what to do. He will give you the key. I have saved what I could. It's not much, but I hope it is enough. It is hidden where the sun sets first, under the watchful eye of the old oak. Find it. Pay the debt. Make this place your own. Live a good, quiet life, Leo. That is all I have ever wanted for you. Forgive me for the pain I caused. Know that it was born of a love so fierce it chose to break its own heart to keep yours beating safe." That was the last letter. It was dated just a few days before she died. The box was empty now, except for my birth certificate and a stack of faded envelopes that held the truth of my life. The house was completely dark. I didn't bother to look for a light switch. I sat there in the shadows, the letters clutched in my hand, and I grieved. I grieved for the grandmother I had never truly known, and for the boy who had grown up believing he was unloved. The weight of the last 10 years, the anger, the loneliness, it all came crashing down on me. I was completely unmade. And in the wreckage, for the first time, I felt a flicker of something new, a sense of purpose, a sense of home. This house wasn't a ruin, it was a promise. It was the final act of a woman who had given everything for me. The developer's offer wasn't a life raft, it was a betrayal. Selling this land would be like spitting on her grave. It would be like agreeing that her sacrifice meant nothing. The choice wasn't a choice at all, not anymore. I had to stay. I had to fight for this place. I had to find the money she had saved. I had to make her sacrifice worth it. Wiping the tears from my face with the back of my dusty hand, I stood up. The first step was to survive the night. The second was to find the old oak tree. Have you ever been in a position where the easiest path felt like the wrong one, where you had to choose between a simple escape and a difficult, meaningful fight? It's a moment that defines you. It's where you discover what you're really made of. For me, that moment happened in the dark, in that cold, silent house. If you've ever faced a choice like that, I want you to know you're not alone. This community, this channel, is built for people who understand that the hardest roads often lead to the best destinations. Thank you for being here, for listening this far. Now, let's get back to the story. The night was long and cold. I found a stack of old quilts in a cedar chest at the foot of the bed and wrapped myself in them, sleeping on the armchair in the main room. The house groaned and settled around me, the sounds of an old structure breathing. Every creak, every whisper of wind outside felt like a message from the past. I didn't sleep much. My mind was racing, replaying the words from the letters, piecing together the new reality of my life. The anger I'd carried for so long was gone, replaced by a profound, aching love and a fierce, burning determination. The next morning, I woke to the sun streaming through the dirty windows, painting stripes of light across the dusty floor. The world outside was alive with the sound of birdsong. For the first time, the silence of the woods didn't feel oppressive. It felt peaceful. I had a mission, where the sun sets first under the watchful eye of the old oak. I went outside. The morning air was crisp and clean. I scanned the edge of the clearing that surrounded the house. The property was bordered by dense forest on three sides, but to the west, the land sloped down into a small valley, offering a clear view of the horizon. That had to be where the sun set first. And standing right at the edge of that slope, its massive branches spreading out like a silent guardian, was an enormous ancient oak tree. It was easily the oldest, biggest tree on the property, its trunk gnarled and thick, its bark like a wrinkled old face. The watchful eye. I walked toward it, my boots sinking into the soft, damp earth. The tree was even more impressive up close. It felt ancient, powerful. I looked around its base, searching for any sign of disturbed ground, a loose rock, anything. The ground was covered in a thick carpet of moss and fallen leaves. I started digging with my bare hands, pulling away the damp layers of forest debris. The soil was dark and rich, but solid. I spent an hour circling the tree, digging test holes, finding nothing but roots and rocks. Frustration began to set in. Was I wrong? Was it a riddle I wasn't understanding? I leaned against the trunk, exhausted and disheartened. I looked up into its sprawling branches, and that's when I saw it. It wasn't a spot on the ground. It was a place in the tree itself. About 10 feet up, where a massive lower branch met the trunk, there was a dark hollow, a natural cavity where the wood had rotted away over the years. It looked like an eye staring out over the valley, the watchful eye of the old oak. My heart leaped. I had to get up there. The bark was rough, offering plenty of handholds. I started to climb, my city-soft hands scraping against the coarse surface. It was harder than it looked. I pulled myself up, branch by branch, until I was level with the hollow. I peered inside. It was dark and deep. I reached my arm in, my fingers brushing against cobwebs and damp, rotting wood. And then I felt it. Something solid, wrapped in cloth. My fingers closed around it, and I pulled it out. It was another package wrapped in oilcloth, just like the one that had held the box of letters. It was heavy, dense. I carefully climbed back down, my precious discovery held tight against my chest. I sat on the ground at the base of the great tree, my back against its solid trunk, and I unwrapped my grandmother's final gift. Inside the oilcloth was a simple tin biscuit box. It was rusted at the edges, the painted flowers on the lid faded and chipped. I held my breath and lifted the lid. It was full of cash. Old bills, tightly packed and bound with rubber bands. 50s and 20s and hundreds. I started counting, my hands trembling so badly I could barely separate the bills. The rubber bands were brittle and snapped as I removed them. I laid the stacks out on the grass. When I finished, I counted it again just to be sure. $10,540. Enough. It was enough to pay the back taxes with a few $100s to spare. I sat there for a long time, the money spread out in front of me, the morning sun warming my face. I laughed, a raw, choked sound that was half sob. She had done it. The quiet, fierce, stubborn old woman had done it. She had saved the land for me. She had given me not just a home, but a future. The weight of her sacrifice, the sheer force of her love, settled over me. This land wasn't just dirt and trees anymore. It was sacred ground. It was my responsibility. That afternoon, I walked the 5 miles back to the town of Harmony. The walk felt different this time. I wasn't a lost boy anymore. I was a landowner. I had a purpose. I found a payphone outside the general store and used the number from the business card. "Thorne and Associates," a crisp voice answered. "I'd like to speak to Heiress Thorne," I said. "My name is Leo Vance." There was a pause, and then Mr. Thorne's familiar, calm voice came on the line. "Leo, I was wondering when I'd hear from you. Have you had time to consider the offer?" "I have," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I'm rejecting the offer from West Pine Development." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear him processing it. "Leo," he said slowly, "are you sure about that? The tax debt is significant. $5,000 could set you up somewhere new." "I'm sure," I said. "My grandmother, she left instructions, and she left me the money for the taxes. I want to pay them. I want to keep the property." Another pause, longer this time. When he spoke again, the professional detachment was gone from his voice. It was replaced with something warm, something that sounded like pride. "Eleanor always did have a plan," he said, a smile in his voice. "All right, son, all right. Here's what we need to do. Get yourself to a bank and get a cashier's check made out to Cinder Creek County for the full amount. I'll meet you at the county clerk's office tomorrow morning at 10. We'll file the payment and the deed transfer. We'll make it official." "Okay," I said, a wave of relief washing over me. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne." "No, Leo," he said softly. "Thank you. You've made an old man very happy. Your grandmother would be so proud." The next day was a blur of official business. I got the cashier's check, feeling the nervous weight of carrying more money than I'd ever seen. I met Mr. Thorne at the county courthouse, a small, stately building that looked like it hadn't changed in a century. He guided me through the process, his calm presence a steadying force. We stood before a clerk, a stern-faced woman behind a tall counter, and I handed over the check. She stamped a series of documents with loud, satisfying thuds. Just like that, it was done. The debt was paid. The land was mine, free and clear. As we were leaving, a man in a sharp suit intercepted us in the hallway. He had a slick, predatory smile. "Mr. Vance," he said, extending a hand. "Rick O'Connell, West Pine Development. I was sorry to hear you rejected our initial offer. I'm here today to present a new one. $20,000. Cash. We can have the paperwork drawn up this afternoon." He was looking at me, but I could feel his condescension. He saw a kid from the system, poor and desperate. He saw an easy mark. A year ago, a week ago, he would have been right. But he wasn't looking at that kid anymore. I looked him straight in the eye. "The property is not for sale." His smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Son, let's be realistic. That property is a wreck. It'll take tens of thousands to make it livable. This is a golden opportunity for you. Take the money and run." "I'm not running," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I'm home. Now, if you'll excuse us." I walked past him, Mr. Thorne at my side. I didn't look back. Outside, in the bright sunlight, I felt 10 feet tall. I had faced the first challenge, the first test, and I hadn't backed down. Mr. Thorne clapped me on the shoulder. "That was well done, Leo. They'll probably be back. They don't give up easily. But you hold on. That land is worth more than they'll ever offer." He handed me a folder with all the official, stamped documents. "It's all yours now. What's your next move?" "I'm going to go home," I said, "and I'm going to get to work." The work was hard, harder than anything I had ever done. The first week was about triage. I bought cleaning supplies, trash bags, and basic tools with the few $100s I had left. I started with the inside of the house. I washed every surface, scrubbing away years of dust and grime. I beat the dust out of the old quilts and aired out the whole house, letting the fresh, clean scent of the forest chase away the mustiness. Slowly, painstakingly, the house began to feel less like a tomb and more like a home. I learned to live simply. There was a well with a hand pump out back that, after a lot of effort, produced clear, cold water. There was no electricity, so my days were governed by the sun. I woke at dawn and worked until dusk. At night, I read my grandmother's books by candlelight. I learned about gardening, about carpentry, about living off the land. Her books became my teachers. The biggest challenge was the roof. It leaked in a dozen places. I knew I couldn't afford to hire a professional, so I learned. I read books from the town library. I watched videos on my phone when I could get a signal. I bought tin sheets and roofing tar with the last of my money and spent a week on that roof, patching, sealing, and replacing panels. It was dangerous, exhausting work. But when the first rain came after I was done, and I sat inside, dry and secure, listening to the water drum against the tin, the feeling of pride and accomplishment was overwhelming. I had protected my home. Slowly, I began to connect with the small community. The general store owner, a gruff but kind man named Sal, started giving me a discount on supplies. The mail carrier, a friendly woman named Mary, would stop and chat for a few minutes each day. They were wary at first, another outsider. But they saw me working. They saw me staying. And in a place like Harmony, staying meant something. One day, Sal came by in his pickup truck. "Heard you were fixing up the old Vance place," he said, leaning against the door. "Your grandmother was a good customer. Stubborn as a mule, but a good woman." He looked at the work I'd done on the porch, where I'd replaced the rotting boards. "You're doing right by her." He nodded toward the bed of his truck. "Got some extra lumber from a project. Figured you could use it." It wasn't just lumber. It was an acceptance. It was a sign that I was no longer just an intruder. I was becoming a part of the place. I was putting down roots. Months passed. The seasons turned. I planted a small garden in the same spot my grandmother's letters had described. I tilled the soil, planted the seeds, and tended the small shoots as they grew. When I harvested my first tomato, warm from the sun, and ate it right there in the garden, the taste was more satisfying than any meal I'd ever had. I was living. I was building something real. The house was still rustic, still scarred by time, but it was warm and safe. It was mine. The land, once a wild and intimidating tangle, was now a place of peace. I knew every path, every tree, every sound. It was no longer just a property. It was my sanctuary, my fortress. I often think about that day in Mrs. Gable's office when I was an 18-year-old boy with nothing but a cardboard box, and a future that looked like a long, empty road. I think about the choice I faced, the easy money versus the difficult inheritance. It's funny how the things that look like burdens can sometimes be our greatest gifts. This land, this house, they looked like a debt, a ruin. But they were a legacy, not of money, but of love, of sacrifice, of resilience. My grandmother taught me that home isn't just a place you are given, it's a place you build. It's a place you fight for. It's a place you earn. She gave me the key, but it was up to me to turn the lock, to step inside, and to have the courage to face what I found there. She saved my life all those years ago by letting me go, but she saved my soul by leaving me a way back. This place, this quiet corner of the world, it taught me everything. It taught me how to work, how to be self-reliant, how to be patient. It taught me that the past is never truly gone. It lives in the soil, in the bones of a house, in the stories we tell ourselves. And it taught me that we have the power to change that story. We can reframe the narrative. Abandonment can become protection. A curse can become a blessing. An ending can become a new beginning. I still have the letters. I keep them in the same metal box, and I read them sometimes, on cold nights when the fire is crackling in the hearth. They are a reminder of where I came from, and of the incredible strength of the woman who made sure I would have a place to go. I am Leo Vance, and I am home. This journey, from a lost kid in the system to a man standing on his own land, it was about more than just a house. It was about finding my own story, and I want to thank you for letting me share it with you. If this story resonated with you, if it touched on something in your own life about second chances, or family, or the true meaning of home, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe and become a part of this community. And I have a question for you. What is the most important thing you've ever inherited that had nothing to do with money? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one, and I believe that our stories are the most valuable things we have. Thank you for listening. Be brave, and know that no matter where you are, you have the power to build your own home.